Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Field Between, a bi podcast in every sense, coastal, sexual, racial, and bi-weekly as of late, because now it is actually a tri podcast in that we are coming out tri-weekly, and we are trying, and there are three of us today. My name is Ahmed.
I'm Yasmin. We're happy to be back.
And we're joined by Mehr Sher. And I should have actually, before we started, asked you if that's an okay pronunciation, but if not, you can correct me.
That was perfect.
Was that good?
Perfect.
You're not lying to me?
No, I'm not. Mehr Sher. You got it.
Perfect. Mehr is an investigative journalist whose work has been in Al Jazeera fault lines, and most recently in Drop Site with an article that we're going to talk about a little bit here today. Mehr, thanks for coming and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you guys.
Yeah, and so the reason for us doing this episode, it's going to be a little bit shorter, but this is going to be a lead-in kind of interview about the piece that you did. We actually interviewed the subjects of your piece titled I'm gonna, sorry if I mess it up, but it's like how 51-second video could put a student in prison for 34 years. Is that the title, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
That's the title of the investigation. And it's all based on the police body camera footage and the decision making of the prosecutors in the case.
Yeah. So we actually talked to the subject of the piece, Muhammad Ali, like I think back in November or December.
Yeah, a couple months ago. But then when we heard that this piece is coming out, we wanted to wait and have that come out first.
Yeah.
So we've been kind of sitting on that interview for a bit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it still resonates, but just in case people hear something that sounds like a little anachronistic, that's probably why. But yeah, we read the piece. You did an excellent job treating it. And I actually, one of the things I just did not know, even after talking to Muhammad, is just like how serious these charges are. But could you just kind of give us an overview of the case? And we'll start there and go from there.
So the entire case revolves around an incident with a Pitt campus police officer. It was a struggle over a fallen police barrier, lasted less than a minute. The body camera footage that I feature in the story is 51 seconds, and hence why it's titled How a 51-second Incident Could Result in, these serious charges. The charges that Muhammad is facing that stem from this incident are felony level charges. He's facing 3 felonies and 4 misdemeanors, and the most serious charges against him carry a maximum sentence of 34 years in prison. Now, he was not the organizer of the encampment at the campus. This was a protest that occurred outside of the encampment in June 2024, and he was just one of the demonstrators that were present that day. And protesters had started pulling apart these zip-tied metal barriers to try to access the folks in the encampment and get food and supplies to them. And as the police kept putting these barriers farther out to block that access, protesters got a bit frustrated the second day on June 3rd and started pulling them apart. I do not know that Muhammad was involved in any of that, but in the footage that we see him lifting this fallen barrier. And that's when the confrontation between Lieutenant Brooke Riley, the campus police officer, and Muhammad sort of stems from.
That footage was so striking. I actually hadn't seen it yet, though I am, a professor at Pitt and have been following this really closely. We both have. I was curious, why did you decide to include the footage, and what are you hoping the viewers will get out of the footage?
Yeah, so, in investigative journalism, our entire storytelling process, reporting process revolves around the evidence that we're able to gather. I think anyone who reads a story can tell what we've been able to prove through our reporting and what we haven't been able to prove, and where we are just able to raise questions. So for me, from that point of view, it was very important to make sure that we include the police body camera footage because I can relay an incident to you, right? It may or may not make sense until you see it for yourself. And we just wanted to open it up to the audience to not only read the story, but watch the footage and see what it is, you know, what happened and what the incident really is that he's being charged for. You know, you sort of see the whole interaction from start to finish.
Yeah, as I'm curious, if was there anything that you expected to find going into like when you first picked up the story, and then when you got into it, did that kind of align with your expectations, or did you find that they diverged greatly, or like how much, if any?
So when I first got into the story, I honestly, you know, like I know we're in this national moment where we're seeing people on campuses nationwide facing the repercussions of protests they were involved in a year ago, 2 years ago, and its consequences for the First Amendment and for the right to protest. But I didn't expect to get into the story and be investigating it for what ended up being almost half a year. I really thought that this was going to be a piece that would be a daily piece. I figured there are some incredible journalists in Pittsburgh that I could pass the story on to, or someone on the national level. But when I spoke to Mohammed and I had a conversation with him about his case, and he told me all the details that kind of led up to it, and the confrontation itself, and how the case has been proceeding in the court system, I realized that the story was much bigger than just a story for Pittsburgh. This is a story that resonates with the national audience. This is a story that we're not really looking at as much anymore, even though these people are facing the consequences of whatever incidents they were involved in a year ago or 2 years ago. And some of them are facing very harsh penalties, like Muhammad.
That's something I really appreciate about your piece. I feel like there's been a lot more coverage of like the Ivies and kind of more well-known universities, but these consequences are happening across the country on campuses for students at a variety of different types of campuses. And I think here, even in Pittsburgh, even amongst like people who show up to protests and people who are fairly well informed, there just doesn't seem to be a lot of like information about what's happened to the defendants. It sort of feels like, you know, that was a few years ago and it's not really on people's radar anymore. And it kind of makes me wonder, I don't even know the answer to this question, but like, I don't really have a good gauge of like, is this happening at campuses across the country? I mean, I assume so, but I like don't hear those stories. So I don't really know. I just know my own campus. And then I know kind of like more high profile campuses that get more coverage.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm referring to. We just don't have a good sense for it because there's not much reporting around what actually happened to some of these students afterwards. I know there's some cases, maybe like the incident is different, right? Different from what Muhammad was involved with. But they're also facing felonies. There's some students from Stanford who are currently, you know, whose trial is currently taking place. So there are cases, they're just not being reported on. They've kind of slipped past people's radars, as you said. And I think what's happening now is far more important to report on. And that's what Muhammad's story really gets at. There was reporting about Columbia, there was reporting about other high profile universities you mentioned. But one of the things that really stood out to me also was just the history of the University of Pittsburgh handling these issues, how they dealt with the SJP study-in, and how they handled one of their own professors who supported students who were advocating for Palestine. So yeah, just the history of all of that to me felt like there's much more to dig into here. And I hope that people continue to report on Muhammad's case and on the University of Pittsburgh and their handling of the Palestine issue at large on campus and of protests.
Just real quick for people who don't know, though, I think we talked about this in the interview with Muhammad. The SJP at Pitt was actually banned, but then the ACLU filed a lawsuit and it was reinstated.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it was reinstated because the federal judge ruled that it was a violation of protected speech. So we already kind of see that there's this friction that the University of Pittsburgh has with students that are involved with advocating for Palestine, and that's why Muhammad's story stood out so much.
it's so interesting though, because you would think like some sort of like signal, like the judge shooting down or reinstating SJP at Pitt would deter other universities from doing the same thing. But we just saw a headline yesterday that Duke pulled its SJP funding and also revoked its organizational status on campus. And I'm just like, are we going to see like another ACLU case in North Carolina? It seems like there's still an effort for universities to distance themselves, kind of just like you said, given the broader context of the federal government really just cracking down on anything dealing with Palestine. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I hope we see ACLU in North Carolina take some sort of action, um, because these are, again, as I said, important issues. Um, I spoke to someone at ACLU for this piece, and what he said is that these campuses are just so scared of losing federal funding, and so that's why they have been cracking down on pro-Palestine speech and pro-Palestine protests, and that's really what seems to be the case.
yeah. So I mean, we know Muhammad kind of personally, or we've interacted with Muhammad quite a few times. I don't get the sense that Muhammad is like a bloodthirsty monster. However, like I have been to one of the hearings, and I've heard the charging officer kind of be up on the stand giving the testimony, and she is like a shorter, kind of like more like a diminutive woman, and one of the things that you bring up in your piece is like that Muhammad's lawyer is trying to make a point of is that he's being treated differently than the other defendants because of his race and religion. And just kind of, seeing the video footage, knowing Muhammad personally, and then hearing, if you were to hear her testimony just kind of in a vacuum, you would think she's talking about this like hulking, awful monster who like pinned her down and like put a knife to her throat or something, right? Like it sounds so. I mean, it is like very, very exaggerated in my opinion, but I'm wondering what you found kind of like in the course of reporting. Have you gone back and like listened to her testimony, or have like a sense of what's your sense of like what the prosecution is trying to do in this case?
So when I went into the story, I was really hoping to prove whether or not there was a bias, right? And that's something that is difficult to prove unless you have access to something internal on the prosecution side. I wasn't able to prove anything on that side, but I was able to raise questions based on the court records. And I went through all the testimonies, all the court transcripts, and there were so many things that stood out to me. As you said, the prosecution had a notably aggressive tone. So did the witnesses, Lieutenant Brooke Riley as well. And one of the things that stood out to me was, according to a court document, that the ADA, the Assistant District Attorney, Jimmy Sheets, was wearing an Israeli lapel pin
Yeah.
to the preliminary hearing. He doesn't really say anything to confirm that, but that was something that was raised, which seemed unusual. And then at that same hearing, he threatened to revoke his bail. And he said something along the lines of, "I don't make threats, I make promises," because Muhammad and his attorney objected to postponing that hearing. So there were things like that that popped out to me. Also, that she she said that she wanted to pursue the case because She felt that he didn't see her as a human,
Hmm.
and he didn't apologize to her when he got the chance. Those were things that really stood out to me because she was talking about him apologizing to her at a student conduct hearing in the middle of a criminal case, an ongoing criminal case, which would be against his Fifth Amendment rights, and would be self-incriminating. And then there was also this video file that was presented in court, and it was labeled as anti-Semitic protests. So there's all these things that hint to some sort of bias, but it wasn't something that I was able to definitively prove internally on the prosecution side. But these were all the things that made his case stand out more than any of the others who were charged. And there were 20 people who were charged. Muhammad has the most egregious charges. Um, and he could face up to 34 years in prison.
20 people who are charged, that means just from that encampment, right? From that specific protest.
From the protest outside the encampment,
Right,
yes.
right. Yeah.
And, there's only two people that are still being charged with felonies that are still facing cases. That's Muhammad Ali, who we're talking about, whose case stands out because he's the only University of Pittsburgh student who's been charged altogether, actually. And then Cole Florkowicz, who's a community member. Muhammad does have more charges than Cole does. I think it's just Cole has one less charge than Muhammad.
That's also a really good reminder for me because I know that we had a lot of like internal to the university, like conduct hearings, but that's obviously very different than a federal charge. I really actually forgot that Muhammad was the only student who was charged like outside of the university, which is obviously not charging outside of like our internal honor court system.
Yeah, so most of the people who were charged, and this was something that there was just so many things as I was reporting on this case that stood out to me more and more and were shocking to find out. Most of the people that were charged were not even University of Pittsburgh students. None of them were, except for Muhammad. They were students from either nearby campuses like CMU, or community members or alumni. But Muhammad was the only University of Pittsburgh student charged. And that doesn't mean that there weren't University of Pittsburgh students at the
Oh
protest.
yeah, there were many, absolutely. And some of them did face consequences again internally through the university, but obviously that's not nearly as severe. And they weren't expelled the way that Muhammad was. So yeah.
Yes. They weren't expelled like he was indeed.
Did you get a sense of, or did you talk to anyone in the university, or were you able to get a hold of anyone to kind of talk about why the university handed off is letting its police department potentially put a student who is pretty precocious, like good community member, but like why they're potentially going to put him in behind bars for like 3 decades?
Yeah, I try to reach out to them several times. I actually reached out to the prosecution, the district attorney's office. I reached out to Lieutenant Brooke Riley. I reached out to campus police. I
Mm-hmm.
reached out to the University of Pittsburgh, and they did respond to me once, but it wasn't specifically with regards to Muhammad's case. It was more of a general question. And then when I went back for more specific things regarding Muhammad's case, they said that they would get back and never did. So I gave everybody an opportunity who was involved with the incident, with the case, to share their perspective with us. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get that and include it. I did get one statement from the university that I mentioned earlier, and it was basically a comment, a statement, just generally on the encampment and on how they ended up dealing with the students and the student conduct hearings. And they said that decisions are made using clear and consistent standards with the goal of balancing individual fairness, accountability, and the safety of the campus community.
Nice.
And that was the only statement I received from them.
This was
Um,
before the piece was published.
this was before the piece
Yeah.
was published and before I went back with very specific questions regarding Muhammad's case,
Yeah.
uh, to get a better understanding of why they chose to expel him. Because through my reporting, I also spoke to a student at CMU, And that's also a campus. All these campuses, right, have been very cautious about pro-Palestine uh, movements on campus, protests, and speech. So I spoke to him, and he told me that he was also dealing with, disciplinary action on campus, and he was also anticipating a student conduct hearing. But he just ended up having to write an essay about what he did and why he did it,
Hmm.
and that was it.
Right. That was a much more
And
common kind of line of punishment for most students that were caught up in this.
I,
exactly. And then we have Muhammad, who is not only facing a criminal case, he's being asked to apologize during a student conduct hearing. He is led to believe that he will be suspended, and then is later surprised with being expelled,
yeah,
effective immediately, and not to be seen on campus. And as you guys know, the campus is very much interspersed throughout Oakland, and areas that, young people are usually around. So
yeah,
they
yeah.
were very
There's like the
harsh.
question of whether the city library, the Carnegie Library, is just like runs right up against Pitt owned land in an area that feels more like a city park than anything else. And the question is like, if I walk on the sidewalk here, if I just walk across this lawn to get to the library, am I going to be arrested? Am I committing a crime?
Exactly. And that's
Yeah.
the anxiety that Mohammed's been living with for over 19 months. Um, and and he's the only one who's faced the most harsh consequences from the university itself, and is now going to be facing trial in May.
Yeah. Has there been any response or any word from the university or any representatives since the piece came out?
No, not at all. And I'm very surprised because my last communication with them, as I said, was, with someone that I would hear back from relatively quickly, a spokesperson for the university, and I was told that I would receive a response by a certain date, and I didn't hear back. But this is very common with stories like this. You know, we don't we don't go in expecting these people to speak to us, but we do our due diligence and we keep trying until the story is published. I reached out to all these parties several times.
Yeah.
Maybe not 10 times, but at least 5 to 7 times, trying to get them to answer questions about Mohammed's case.
Well, especially if they respond, that maybe that first time and they're like, "Yeah, we'll get back to you." It's not like they don't know or didn't see it, right? It's going to someone's inbox. It seems more like a conscious decision to ignore it.
Yeah, and as an investigative reporter, it's also our part of our process to send out no surprise letters. So we sent out, I reached out to all the parties involved. I sent out an email telling them exactly what we were able to find, our core findings, with regards to them and their role in Mohammed's case. So there was no surprise when it was published. It was all information that they had been provided ahead of time would be getting published.
Was there any information that you wanted to get for the story that you kind of just like ran up against roadblocks, or someone was just, it was too tightly controlled by someone, or just was not available to you?
A lot of things. That's such a good question. I really wanted to try to get some more body camera footage from the campus police department. But again, because they have like there's this status that they have where they're not fully able to disclose those documents, and they don't have to,
Hmm.
because they're not entirely a state university. They're what's called and Yasmin, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a public research university,
I believe
correct?
that's right. I know that just generally speaking, we're also like, we are a public university technically, but we're highly privatized. Like, we're one of the more highly privatized public universities across the country.
Right. So with that being said, they don't have to provide me any records I
Yeah.
ask for. And so I was hoping that I would get more angles of the incident and maybe more footage of the aftermath, of that 51-second footage that I do have access to. So there's so many things that I wasn't able to access just because of that.
Yeah,
Because
one
it's a public research university and it's state related, quote unquote, but isn't a state university where I could FOIA.
yeah,
Uh,
I was gonna say
and
just
then,
real quick, like one has to
sure.
assume that like there is more body camera footage. There are a lot of police there standing all around, and it is like strange that the evidence seems to just be this one 51-second video, and like
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I think when it goes to trial, I'm hoping that there will be more footage, perhaps that's presented as evidence, but it is unusual. And I spoke to a criminal defense attorney about this as well, and he said there has to be, if it was so heavily policed, if the encampment was so heavily policed, there has to be multiple angles of what took place.
Mhm.
So I wasn't able to access that. And then I was also trying to get some sort of internal communications from the university. I know that the Board of Trustees has some indirect members who uh, are in office. So the governor is one of those, the mayor is one of those, and there's a few other positions like that. I tried to FOIA those emails, any emails that would have involved communication about the encampment to try to understand what the internal dialogue was behind the decision making. And those were things that I received that were incomplete or just didn't include anything about the encampments.
That's so interesting. I didn't realize that the kind of like status of how public we are would affect the reporting aspect. That's fascinating. Just another element that kind of stands out to me about this story compared to, again, thinking about Columbia and thinking about the NYPD, the New York Police Department, getting involved in a lot of the student protests in New York, is that like they were campus police specifically that were sicked on students. And I think that creates a really interesting dynamic with just like what the kind of relationship looks like between campus police and students after the encampment. And I thought it was noteworthy that like the Pittsburgh police were not, to my knowledge, involved, that it was specifically like our own campus police that were kind of turned on students is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mohammed actually mentioned this to me. This was something that I didn't include in detail in the story just because again we were limited for space. We wanted to make sure that it's a story that is comprehensive without getting too into the weeds, but also can can show and reveal prosecutorial discretion and the disparity in decision making. But Mohammed had actually met Lieutenant Riley at two previous protests before. And this was something that occurred to him later after that 51-second incident. If you guys remember in the footage, in the beginning, she is yelling at him and she's saying, "Do you remember me? I remember you."
And then she
And
says, "You want to hurt me," which is so fucking creepy and weird. Like she says it multiple times, like something to that effect, right?
so she says that in the very beginning, and
Yeah.
she's pointing generally into the crowd, pointing her finger at people in the crowd and asking them, "Do you want to hurt me? Do you want to hurt me?" And then we see Muhammad walking into the frame, checking on the protester who's in front of her to see if he's okay, and then her yelling at him, and then that's where the incident sort of begins. But it was interesting to me that Muhammad had mentioned to me that I didn't recognize her in the moment because I was
Caught
I
up
was
in the
kind of
moment. Yeah.
caught up in what's happening and trying to make sense of it in real time. But afterwards, I realized that yes, I had met her. He told me that he had asked her at two prior protests where to stand and, what to do, what's allowed. And that's usually what is expected of a relationship between students and campus police. Um, but you're right to question whether that dynamic changes after incidents like this.
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that like in such a, I guess, kinetic, high energy situation, that she was consciously asking people, "Do you want to hurt me?" Knowing that her body cam was on, and that they could then probably just like splice the footage and put out again a 51-second clip of their choosing to make someone look as violent as possible. Um, Speaks to, I mean, yeah, it begs the question about like what their intentions are as a police department, and whether they are maybe even coordinating with someone else to fuck up as many of these kids' lives as possible.
I think the lack of coordination also is part of what makes it creepy, like that it is just a university.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That it's not like an external force, that it's not the city. Yeah.
Right. And one would think that a university would protect its own students,
Right. Yeah.
and that that is the purpose of having campus police. The dynamic definitely seems to be changing, and it's one that we need to pay more attention to. I think we definitely need to pay more attention to these cases, and more journalists should be reporting on what's happening and how people are going to be punished going forward for protests like this on campus.
Right. And of course, like, I mean, on this podcast, Palestine is an issue that's really close to our hearts, but like the ramifications really could apply to any kind of campus protest. Like there's setting precedents that could really be applied to any sort of free speech issue, which is also, I think, worth noting.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that was something that's the whole reason why I was drawn to the story. Like, sure, right now we're reporting on pro-Palestine protests, and their repercussions, but this is something that could be applied to anything in the future. And we're not a country without a history of seeing similar scenarios at other protests. We've seen what happened during the anti-war protests for Vietnam on campuses. These aren't things that haven't happened before. It's how they're being handled that may be different.
Is there any other footage other than this 51-second video that the prosecution has revealed, or any other footage that's come to light?
So while I didn't have footage of different angles of the incident that Mohammed has been charged with, there was footage of some of the confrontations between police and protesters. And one of the videos that I referred to in the piece and that I've included a still from and described at length is of Mohammed standing in front of a protester, another community member, Andrew Collins, who was charged with a similar felony level charge and later provided the opportunity to go through ARD, a way to reduce his charges and clear his record in the future. But what happens is that there's a campus police officer who's pointing this non-lethal firearm into the crowd, and Mohammed sees this, and he stands in front of Andrew Collins, in whose direction it's being pointed, and the campus police officer, and he raises his hands and he says, "Hands up, don't shoot." So while we have this footage that Mohammed is being charged with, we also have this footage where he is actively trying to de-escalate the situation.
And where it sounds like he's afraid, like he is genuinely afraid that there might be use of force against him.
Yeah.
It was the first time he had ever had a gun pointed to him. That's what he told me during our many interviews, that it was a defining moment for him because he's never been in that situation before.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I think I mentioned it in like the interview with Muhammad that's to follow, but it's just so frustrating to see stuff like that. But then there's no real way for Muhammad, for example, or anyone else who was at these encampments to pursue charges against police officers for use of violence that is escalatory in nature.
Right. It's so normalized also in our country for police to point weapons at people that it's basically legal. Like there's no way to kind of like bring a charge for that. Yeah.
Something that I really want to emphasize that I think is important for anyone who is listening to this, anyone who's interested in Muhammad's story at large, is that Muhammad has no criminal record. This is something that was raised by the prosecution during one of the hearings, that the reason why other people were given leniency and Muhammad wasn't was because he had had prior interactions with the police, because they consider him the de facto leader of the encampment, of the protest, and that the nature of the injuries to Lieutenant Brooke Riley were egregious. And I have things to add for each of those points. One, he has no criminal record. It's publicly available data that I can check. He has none. The interactions that they're referring to are, again, previous interactions I mentioned where he asks Lieutenant Brooke Riley where to stand in certain situations in the past, because she's been at these protests. She's been present at them before. And then I interviewed 9 other individuals involved with the protest. Seven of those, or somewhere around that ballpark, were people who were actually charged with the protests that Muhammad was charged with. And they all said that he is not the leader. He wasn't the leader of this protest. He was just there. He wanted to show up and support. He wasn't inside the encampment at any point. And as to the nature of her injuries, we know through her testimony that she never took any time off, and she continued to work that day, and she didn't seek medical care.
Yeah. Real quick, I'm curious, just in the course of, speaking with Muhammad and getting to know him a little bit more, um, what's your sense of like what his life is like now? And has he kind of spoken to you about, you know, broader goals, or like how he's trying to get on with his life, or
Or even
anything
like
that?
after the pieces come out? I'd be curious to
Yeah.
hear since we haven't talked to him recently.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to speak for Muhammad, but he's someone who seems to be a force within the community. He's someone who's important to a lot of people. That's something that I discovered through the course of my reporting and speaking to all the people involved. He took his LSAT in January, and he's been working towards law school. He's a very bright, smart, ambitious young man. I think right now he's just trying to make sense of what his future is going to be like, and all of that hinges on the outcome of the trial in May.
What sorts of stories are you working on nowadays? What stories are you interested in telling? And where can people find your work?
Yeah, I'm still working with Fault Lines at Al Jazeera English, and those are more collaborative projects. I'm one of five people on any given project. And apart from that, I'm going to continue to do my independent investigations. I'm currently in the process of identifying what my next story will be, but I'm always drawn to what's underreported. For instance, Mohammed's case was underreported. In fact, it seemed almost unreported. And wherever I can find a story where there's some sort of wrongdoing in question, or where we can hold people in power accountable. Those are the stories I'm drawn to, and the stories that I will continue to tell. And people can keep up with my work online, on Twitter, on Instagram. When I work independently, I pitch those stories to different outlets. So they're featured in a number of places.
Great. Well, you did a great job with this one. Thank you so much for all the hard months of hard work that went into this. Definitely, if you haven't yet, please go read that piece and follow Mehr on all the platforms she just mentioned.
And we'll definitely link the piece and
We'll link the
and
piece.
tag you as well.
For
Yeah.
sure. All right.
Thank you, Mehr.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Coming up, second half of the episode is our full interview with Muhammad. So
And
enjoy.
Hiba.
Muhammad and Hiba. Yeah, thank you.